Hi, Temimah.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Temimah Zucker is a social worker and she specializes in eating disorders. And
Mhm.
we actually go way back. We're friends for a
Mhm.
long time. And go ahead, introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been in the field of eating disorders in various capacities. I think it's been about 8 years now. I've been working at a day treatment program for over 6 years. I'm now the assistant clinical director there at Montanito, Manhattan.
Wow.
I also work in private practice, and then I speak and write on the subjects of eating disorders and body image and other mental health related issues. And I like to say and think that I specialize in working within the Jewish community as well. So those are sort of my main areas of interest and work at this point.
Okay, that's awesome. Very impressive.
Thanks.
And and so I'm a registered dietitian and I am beginning my journey into working in the field of eating disorders. And I like to say, like, I feel like I struggled with disordered eating as a teen, but never with the full diagnosis of an eating disorder. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience as a teenager with food, body image stuff,
Sure.
and how that affected you as a teen and how it affects you now.
Sure. So yeah, that's also an important point to note that I'm recovered. So I say recovered very specifically, meaning I'm not in recovery. There are sort of two schools of thought. One is that you're always in recovery, similar to the addictions model. The other is that you can be fully recovered. That is the philosophy that I kind of subscribe to. So I do not have an eating disorder anymore, although I did at one point. And what is kind of cool, just briefly, is that where I work, Montanito is a program that really supports clinicians who are recovered working in the field. Since I think it's also a debate too of should I say something, should I not? This is personal. Some people want to. So I am recovered. And so I guess to start, similarly, I think when I was younger, I struggled with disordered eating as well. That was really like not picked up on by anyone, even myself, which I think is an important thing to note. There are many people who struggle with disordered eating and an eating disorder, and it's not simply denial that they know there's a problem but don't want to face it. I think that there's also a lack of awareness, given that our culture is so kind of flooded with disordered eating habits, both restrictive and binge-like, and even purging. Purging, can be purging through exercise. How often do we hear someone say, like, it's okay if I eat this now, I'll work it off later? That's
Right.
a purge, technically. So I would say that when I was a teenager and I was younger, what really like young teens, I struggled with disordered eating, but I don't think I even knew it because it's so steeped in our culture, which is really heartbreaking. But then I developed a full-fledged eating disorder when I was sort of later in my teens. And oh man, that was a journey. Where would you like me to begin, Gila? What would feel helpful?
So I kind of want to hear when you say that you had like disordered eating patterns, like
Yeah.
what do you think triggered that? Do you think it was just diet culture being so loud?
No, it's a great question. I think it's never one thing, right? So it doesn't exist in a vacuum. I think it was probably a combination of, yes, diet culture in terms of really the fat phobic sentiments around us and people. I think everyone, Gila and I have known each other for a long time. Like people around us just being normal, being like, "What diet are you on? What are
Right.
you not?"
Right.
Which I never really felt like I was a part of, but I think I also just like didn't. So if we're talking about what is disordered eating, really briefly, what does that mean to have kind of ordered eating, if you will?
Right.
Like the definition I like to give is eating when you're hungry, stopping when you're full, and having variety. Which doesn't mean that anything beyond that is necessarily disordered. Sometimes we eat emotionally, that's okay. But I think like as a pattern, to say like I won't eat X or to say like I won't eat when I'm hungry is a disordered kind of factor. So I would say that's more of what it was for me as opposed to like diet food rules where I just wasn't very in touch with hunger and fullness, or I would have these sort of like not compulsive episodes, but eat more like at the end of the day. I wouldn't eat throughout the day, but I eat a lot in the evening. And that was considered normal to me, but that wasn't normal, that my energy was not going to the right places, things like that.
Mhm.
So I think it was probably a combo of sure, like diet culture in the sense that like messages being confusing around me about food, and emotionally like that was a time when there were lots of changes happening. And when is life not full of change? But especially when we're adolescents and we can't handle our emotional experience as well. There's a lot of feedback or research around that. So I think it was sort of like interpersonal dynamics, psychologically, just I struggled with depression at the time. I think there's sort of this like culmination of different factors that when it first started, it wasn't, oh, let me use food as a coping mechanism. But I think that was sort of something that could have been kept an eye on, but because it's so normalized, right, it wasn't. And I don't blame anyone for that. I don't think necessarily if someone had caught it, that would have been it with my eating disorder. I don't know. I can't say that. I don't think there's even a point in wondering. But I think it was a combination of things. A long answer for a short question.
Right. No, that's a really good answer. And I think it's like really important for listeners to hear who don't have any concept of like what the difference between dieting and eating disorder is, like how like people think that's totally not the same thing. But obviously, like as I've been learning in my own courses that like usually the start of an eating disorder is a diet. That's like
it can be. Yeah, I think it can be. I think it's not always, but I think that a diet doesn't help is what I like to tell people, because there's sort of a misconception that it's like an eating disorder is a diet gone wrong. And yes, it totally can be that someone starts, let's say, restricting, and that leads to either like a binge purge restrict cycle or maybe just the restrictive tendency. But I think either way, like a diet doesn't help the situation, doesn't help someone who's already like steeped in using food to cope, maybe with trauma, with, you know, internally feeling like they don't have the coping mechanisms to tolerate their distress, whatever the thing is. The diet culture and the diets don't do anything good for people is what I like to tell people.
Right. I mean, I agree with that 100%. Like in my own practice, I don't do dieting at all. I use the approach of intuitive eating, but we're not even going to go there tonight. But basically, so you developed this like disordered eating pattern. You weren't really aware of it. Your family maybe wasn't aware of it. Your friends weren't maybe aware of it. And it wasn't anything too serious, you would say?
Yes.
Until it became too serious and it was like too late to just break the pattern.
Yeah, I think it's so tricky, and I think it's a really important subject because I think that I think disordered eating is sort of so normalized that people are like, okay, whatever, it's not a problem. Right. Now, for some people, you could say like, that's partially true, that it doesn't develop into a full-blown eating disorder. And yet the way I think of it is like, it's not helping you live a fulfilling life to also be experiencing that, right? So even if someone's like, but I'm okay, I don't have a full eating disorder, it's like, sure. And like, are your values like being lived to the fullest if you're busy thinking about like how you're going to lose weight and what you're going to eat, as opposed to like, I'm just enjoying my time with friends. Just really but yeah, I think it was like one of those things that spiraled, but I would even say that only recently have I noticed what my disordered patterns were before my eating disorder. Like, I think until recent years, I would have just said like, it happened really fast. You know, it happened within like a very short time frame that I went from like a normal eater to full-blown eating disorder. But actually now really knowing more about intuitive eating and disordered eating versus an eating disorder, I'm able to reflect on like, no, it like wasn't normal for a while. But I don't think I ever thought, or anyone ever thought, like this will turn into something, because for many people it doesn't. People can go through diets their whole lives and not have a full-blown eating disorder. So I also want to be careful. This isn't meant to be like a message like it could happen to you. It totally could, but it's not like it could happen. So don't do it. It's like, it might not happen. And that's why I always say like, and are you living your life to the fullest if you're busy worrying about dieting? It's just like my PSA. Yeah.
That's a good point, because like, I feel like a lot of our culture in general now is teaching people out of fear. And like shame and guilt, and like that's so not my approach. And I don't know, I'm very into Brene Brown, and she's a shame researcher, and like I just always go back to her research. And we don't have to scare anyone into like not getting an eating disorder. We don't have to convince anyone not to go on a diet. Like, do whatever works for you. We're just talking about one person's experience, and like there's obviously from your own clinical experience, you could say like, you know, 50% of my clients experience this, or this is very common, or you could also say like, this is just your experience, and that's, you know, maybe
absolutely. Yeah, I can only speak for me. I think though that it's important to note, like, I actually last night I got into like a Facebook war with people because
I've heard about these Facebook wars. I stay off of Facebook.
and I like to think that I'm really respectful and kind. I'm not like shaming anyone, but someone was posting about like a group that basically like you win money when you post your weight. And if your weight goes down, like you get money for it.
Right.
And I just posted it. I was like, as an eating disorder therapist and survivor, like, I just think people should be careful. Like this group can promote like fat phobia and diet culture. And of course people are like, keep your judgments to yourself. And I was like, I'm really not trying to judge. I'm trying to help. But I think people hear that and they think what I mean to say is like, you could catch an eating disorder. And that's not my point. My point is just like, are our eyes fully open to like what this is doing for us and the way that we live? And like, if that's what you do, absolutely. Like you do you. I'm not here to preach or to tell someone like, you can't live like that. And I think sometimes people go through things thinking like this is the way of the world, as opposed to wondering like, oh, like if I'm limiting my worth based on how I look, like, is that really in line with who I am? Right. And that's the question I just want to encourage people to be asking themselves, as opposed to like exactly what you're saying, scaring you into like, you have to do it a certain way.
Right. And like, I have had some eating disorder clients myself, and I have a supervisor who helps me, and it's just so interesting. I always go back to this like point and this like training that she's like embedded in my mind, is that like, we ask our clients, like, what's your value system? Why do you want to recover? Why do you want to get better? Is that behavior in line with your value system? And it's like so different from what we're always taught about dieting. Like, what's so bad about dieting? Like, I just want to be healthy. I just want to be happy. I just want to be skinny. And like, of course there's nothing wrong with wanting to be healthy, happy, or skinny, but it's like, at what cost? Like, I recently just learned that like a regular person would think about food, let's say 15 to 20% of the day. When am I eating lunch? What am I making for dinner? Right. And someone with an eating disorder could be like 80 to 100% of your day. Yeah. So emotional energy, you only have a certain amount of emotional energy. And if you're delegating it to mostly your food, like, it's really hard to live like a wholehearted life, like Brene Brown.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the ACT approach. Acceptance and commitment therapy is all about like, are you living according to your values?
Right.
And I think too, to add to your thought, the question of like, is this according to your value? And you had said like, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be healthy, like fit, skinny. Absolutely. And I would ask like, and where is that coming from for you? Is that because someone else is telling you to? Is, like that kind of a thing is an important question. Because I think that some people are like, oh, that's just the world. And, sometimes it takes a moment. I always promote curiosity. So being curious, like, is even that in line with my value, and where does it come from? I was recently talking to I'm a new mom, talking to new moms, and someone was saying like, I can't wait to like lose the baby weight. And all these people were sort of then going at like another group I'm in, talking about like, oh, you don't have to. Oh, you do. Oh, it's great. I feel great. And I just sort of left my little moment of like, I think exercising after having a baby when you're ready to is wonderful. And why are you like, what about you wants to, what about you? Is it like, because you want the energy, you want to be strong because it's really hard to accept maybe a new body? Or, like, is it because culture is looking at magazines that say like body after birth, go right back, like just where is it coming from? And being curious about that, I think is really valuable and important as we're processing and reflecting what we're seeing in the world and what choices then we make.
Right. And it's interesting about this whole like eating disorder, disordered eating like world that I'm like really embracing since I, work with it on a daily basis. It's like, I've like began to ask my clients this like so often, and I see it in my own life, is that like when you're focusing on your food, let's say either restricting or binging or shopping for food or whatever it is, what are you not thinking about? Sure. And, like, it's easier in a way to deal with a food issue than to deal with, a fight with my husband. So like it's a coping mechanism that we're using in an eating disorder and even not in an eating disorder.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I like to teach eating disorder clients very quickly when they come to the program is, I didn't make this up. I learned this from someone I used to work with, but explaining that an eating disorder is like a flower, and how what people like to talk about and notice and focus on is what's visible in a flower that people talk about, the top, right? Like the bud or the bloom, whatever we're going to call it. People don't look at a flower and say, look at that stem. They look at the top and they say that's so vibrant. And that's what happens with eating disorders. People focus on the symptoms. So, people get caught up in how much are you restricting? What's your weight? Did you purge twice yesterday? And people get alarmed and they get scared. And then beneath that top though, beneath that bud is the stem, which represents the emotional state. And beneath that even are the roots, which are the core beliefs or stuck points. And to fully recover from an eating disorder, you can't just look at the symptoms and only talk about, let's say, body image or food or a meal plan. We have to be looking at what is your emotional experience that's leading you here to, what are you coping with? And even beneath that, what is your core belief that you're addressing consciously or not consciously through whether it's food or self-harm or whatever the behavior is, because it's all just sort of the top of what we see as opposed to the root of what we see. And I think it's a hard thing to do because treating an eating disorder is treating it behaviorally, medically, and psychiatrically and emotionally. Right. So it's not just, one of those things. And many people, either in innocence or insurance companies, will look at it like, okay, medically stable, cool, the person's recovered, or, oh, they haven't purged in a year, that means they're fixed, as opposed to saying, like, what are they emotionally and mentally still experiencing?
Right. And that's why treating an eating disorder, it's so important to have a good team. You can't just have a dietitian, you can't just have a therapist. You have to really all come together and work together, because there's just so many things you have to treat. So let's go back to your eating disorder. So you were in high school and you had these symptoms, but no one really knew. You didn't know yourself.
Yeah.
You're not really sure what triggered it. It was a bunch of things.
When I've spoken about this before, it's funny because I told you this earlier, actually. I rarely talk about my own story now. I'm comfortable doing it, but it's so funny because this I think is important to know. It's so behind me, and I'm so in the world of eating disorders as a clinician now. So I almost have to think of like, okay, let's go back there for a second.
Wow. I'm happy that you're saying this, because I know that my school of thought was that you never recover from an eating disorder. And I think that's why I didn't go into the field until I realized that that's not true. So you continue.
Yeah, no, it's really important. I think people believe that. I have to I can recall everything very easily, but I almost have to go there first. So I think that the contributing factors were themes that really related to grief and loss for me. Sometimes when I've spoken in schools before, I almost use this chart of a staircase and explain that an eating disorder is not you just go into it, you wake up one day, but it could be a culmination of your whole life. So I usually start with my temperament when I was born, I'm a youngest child, I'm a sensitive person, all of those things. Mm-hmm. That's a factor. Right. So I think there was a lot of grief and loss, and I've always been pretty afraid of death and growing up. And I think that everything kind of came together as I was preparing to graduate high school and get ready for this next chapter. And that's when everything kind of hit very, very hard. And I also think I just didn't have the coping skills to know what to do with that. I started school when everyone, most of my friend group, I'll say, was off for a gap year. I didn't do that. So I was kind of alone. Mm-hmm. So I was lonely and afraid of growing up and feeling this grief of my life is changing and my friends, my friend groups are changing, and it all came together, and it definitely was not conscious. It wasn't ooh, I'll decide to have an eating disorder, or even let me use the food to cope. It was just sort of my brain just hit a switch, which actually research shows that for some people genetically, this is what they're finding, that if you go to a certain weight, at least with anorexia nervosa, which is not even the most common eating disorder, but with that one in particular, it's almost a switch gets flicked on, and the eating disorder kind of gains momentum very quickly. Mm-hmm. So it happened somewhat quickly in the sense of how much I dove into it at a very fast pace, which everyone's story is so different, right? So some people are stably unstable for 20 years. And some people are doing this roller coaster, and some people, it's hidden from everyone in their lives. So just to be clear, and I think most people know this, but I'm one person. So I would be so upset if people took what I'm about to say or what I'm sharing here to mean this is every case, because it's so not true at all. But yeah, it happened really kind of fast, if you will.
So let me just ask you a question. Now, as an adult processing what happened then, you're able to say I think it could be a combination of all these things, and maybe even a main factor is that you didn't have those coping skills.
Yeah.
But at the time, were you processing that at all, or you were just in the anorexic mind?
Yeah. I think that I was very aware of how clinically depressed I was, and lonely I was, but I don't think I was aware of like what I was doing. And then my eating disorder really became my whole life. My whole life, maybe like 3% was on like, I had a boyfriend at the time. So I think he kept me alive, you know, so like my relationship with him, which was long distance, and school, I was in school. I did not do well in school, but it was like something I was trying to hold on to. So I think that really like 97% of me was just like my eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you were like basically swept away by this eating disorder.
Yeah.
And so did you get yourself into treatment? Did somebody else put you into treatment?
No. So trying to remember. I did a few different rounds of treatment. So the first time it was my family who were involved. Not everyone has family involved. Not everyone has a support system. Also, some people are like, oh, I like lived my full life. You know, like my eating disorder became like 97% of me. There are some people who are like, I have a full identity. Like it's just on the back burner, but like very present. So the first time I went into treatment was like my parents, I would say. And then the second time, which was very brief, and I was not willing to do it. So I just kind of left. The second time was me. And the factor there that I think was sort of a really beautiful thing is that my dad at the time was working at the Orthodox Union, and they produced this film, Hungry to be Heard, which was many, many years ago. And it featured clinicians and then men and women who were eating disorder survivors. And I actually like knew a couple of the people. I hadn't known like they had eating disorders. And I think for me, I had been so in denial and so ashamed of my eating disorder for a lot of reasons, but especially because I felt like this doesn't really happen in the Jewish community, which I knew logically like wasn't so true, but I don't feel like I had evidence that it wasn't true. So seeing this film actually was the instigator in my even admitting I had a problem, which was like months into my eating disorder. Until that point, even when I was someone who medically became very unstable, even at that point, I was like, nope, you're wrong. My labs are wrong. My heart beats wrong. Like, you're all crazy. But that was the first time I was like, oh, this is a real problem. Other people have it. If I have it, maybe I'm not like this terrible person. And I then pursued treatment like a week later.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy for so many reasons. So let me just ask you, when your parents put you into treatment, was that they picked up on it because you weren't acting yourself, you weren't eating? It was just very obvious.
Yeah, so they mostly noticed how much I wasn't acting like myself. And I like to share that with people too, because people often assume like, unless I see that my person is like going to the bathroom after meals, like it's not a problem. And I say like, look for like mood shifts, look for changes, sure, around food, but also just overall, especially with big life events. So I think that, yes, they noticed like my food was different, but they also were just like, you're really like retreating into yourself. And I recall, this was like starting school around the high holidays, Jewish high holidays. And I went home and they were just like, what's going on? Something's wrong. And I was like, no, everything's fine. Everything's cool. School's great, blah, blah, blah. And I was seeing a therapist at the time that I had been seeing for years. And sort of a few months later, my dad said to me, you know, I'm really concerned. I'd like to come with you to a therapy session. And I said, yes, which I always share as an important anecdote because a part of me knew something was going on. I mean, at the time I was probably like, there's no problem. So you can call. I was very like a lot of attitude, but at the time there must have been a part of me that was like, yeah, I need some help. Like you can come, because otherwise I could have just said like, no, I don't want you there. I'm over 18.
Right.
And he came with me and he told my therapist, like, we're seeing a major shift. Her eating has changed. We're really concerned. And she said, so all future clinicians out there never say this. She said, like, leave it alone. It will go away by itself. And my dad, who is a really just well-educated man in a lot of ways, literally said like, okay, we'll never be seeing you again. Thank you so much. Which like had its own problem just because I should have had a say in that. But he was like, no, you never say that for someone who might be struggling with something behaviorally. Right. So I think my parents then sort of took this next step to be like, all right, she needs more than this. Like, this is not going well. And found me a program that I checked myself out of after not a long period of time.
Right. That's an important piece. And also the therapist, you had been seeing her for many years. Was this because of like your fear of death or fear of grief?
Yeah, it was in relation to I had a really difficult time coping with, my grandmother passed away in high school, and I had a really difficult time coping with that. And then I was in like a really emotionally abusive relationship, which at the time I think no one took super seriously, but really contributed to my stuck points and my core beliefs and my depression. So I was the one who actually said, when I was younger than this, obviously, like, I want to see a therapist. I don't feel okay. So I'd been seeing
Your
her.
parents were on board with that.
Yeah.
And that was a supportive relationship with your therapist?
Yeah.
Until that moment where maybe she wasn't trained in eating disorders.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So that's what you would say, maybe like why she said that?
Probably. I mean, and I think that's where it's like, if you don't know, don't pretend to know. That's okay if you don't know. If someone comes to me and says, I want to talk to you about, ADHD, I would say, I'm not the person. I can do my research, I can talk, I can get consultations, but I'm not an expert in that. Right. So I think that, I think she just didn't know. And I think people assume that this is like a teenage phase. They assume that, like, especially young women, and we know that not all people who have eating disorders are women by any means, but especially young women are, they struggle with things with food, and like, it was a stressful time. And I think it doesn't have to be, there's a gray area. It doesn't have to be like, sound the alarm, someone is eating differently, they need to rush to inpatient. And it also doesn't have to be like, leave it alone. It can be like, we have to monitor this. Let's get other team members on the case here. Let's explore, like, I need to ask more questions. I think that there's a gray that so many people are afraid of, like, what does this mean and what do I do with it? And there are people that you can add on to your team. If let's say you're watching this and you're a therapist and you just think like, I don't know if I'll ever be an expert in eating disorders. It's okay. You can get someone else on board who is, and have a team member, have a full team of a dietitian, you as a therapist, an eating disorder therapist. Like, that's an okay thing.
Right. So now looking back on that, reflecting on that happening, let's say, like, for people who are listening,
Mm-hmm.
what should we be looking out for if we're not gonna sound the alarm at any mood change or change in eating, but we also want to monitor it? So how do we go about that, like, without making the problem worse?
Yep. I think first reflecting on, like, what does a day look like, or a week? Because sometimes a day, people will choose a day where they're like, that day was cool, but what does a week of eating look like for you? Not that it needs to be primarily about eating, but that helps us pay attention to, does it seem like, this is disorder? Does it seem like nothing? What does that look like? I think it's also really exploring mental status, if you will, just clinical term, in terms of, is the person presenting as alert, oriented? Are they forthcoming about their emotions? Are they shut down? Are they guarded? Like, just noticing how someone is presenting. I think that getting ideas of, I think we have to, like, paint the full picture, so it's sort of like, how are you sleeping? So it's not just like, what is your eating? What's your weight? Weight also doesn't really, that's a whole other story we can talk about. Like, weight doesn't really have to play a factor at all. But it's also like, what is your life looking like right now? And the hard thing is, unless someone's honest, we don't know. Because we can have someone go for labs. Some people's labs are always normal, things like that. So it's really tough, because if someone sort of just lies, it's really hard to know. But that's where sometimes getting any type of supporter involved and asking, do I have consent to call your best friend? Do I have consent to call your mom? Things like that. But it's not limiting by just saying, like, let's check your weight. Oh, your weight's in range, so you must not have a problem, which is, again, its own issue. But it's really like, let's paint a full picture. And then the first step typically is, let's get a full team involved, right? So if someone's seeing just a therapist, just a dietitian, let's get a psychiatrist. Let's make sure you're going to a medical doctor who is, like, informed about disordered eating, eating disorders, health at every size if possible, things like that. And then the other thing that can happen is have someone do an assessment with a treatment program, because people are actually then informed what level of care they need. So I think usually people will call and say, like, I need this. And they're informed, like, actually, we're going to ask you a series of questions, and then you're going to be informed what we as the experts are deeming what you need, which can be in a way comforting, because people might think, like, treatment means inpatient, but maybe you just need some IOP, which is a few times a week for a few hours, to help support you on just, like, maintaining what you need to do to have this, like, full life, which is what I hope for people.
Right. And I think that back to, like, the whole fear thing, like, people are just so afraid of the unknown that, like, they don't want to call, or they don't want to take the first step, or they don't want to be forced into treatment. And, like, sort of like to piggyback off of that,
Yeah.
you said that your parents checked you into a treatment center, which you were allowed to check yourself out of. So
Yeah.
can you talk to me a little bit about like how, like if somebody's forced into treatment, like how effective that is?
I think it depends on the person.
Right.
It was a lower level of care, so I wasn't there for that long. I think it's people. Okay, so I don't think it's so black or white. Like people have to be ready and willing, or they can't get better. I think like if I meet a client who on day one tells me like, I don't want to be here, my partner is making me come, otherwise I would not be here. I might say to that person like, okay, what could you get out of being here?
Right.
Like how could we help you?
Right.
And so I've had teenagers especially say to me like, it'll get my mom off my back.
Right.
And I'm like, great, that's all I need. Let's work together on that. You don't really want her doing that. She probably will keep doing that unless you're showing that you can be like an independent person. So can you work with me on that? Right. So I think you can always find a goal that the person can work on. That doesn't mean they're ready to fully recover. I don't really expect anyone to come into treatment. It happens, it's rare, and say like, I'm ready to let go of this. People often don't want to seek help because they don't want to let go because it's serving such a purpose. Right. And that's part of what treatment does. We look at how is this serving a purpose for you? Is that the same purpose that it served when it started? Maybe it's totally different now. And then what will your life look like as you're starting to like kind of let it go in pieces? And how can we help you grieve that as a part of the treatment? So I do think it's possible for people to get help even if it's not their idea to go for treatment. If the people who they're working with can say like, I can't force you to want to get better, but what can we agree to work on at this point?
Right. That's such an interesting point. And it's actually interesting you said like you, as part of treatment, you could like grieve the parts of the eating disorder that you're letting go of, right? And I recently was just reading on Rachel Tuckman's podcast. She's a licensed mental health counselor, and she was talking about like sensitive people. And like I relate to it because like I was always told like you're so sensitive, which was like the most painful thing for me. And when I was reading that, I was like, wow, that's so powerful that like there are just people in this world, like 15 to 20% of people who have like this more sensitive nature. Like you said, you're a sensitive person, you're the youngest, like there's so many factors that can contribute to that high sensitivity level.
Yep.
Sorry. But it's just so interesting that like, I feel like, maybe you could tell me, but I feel like someone with an eating disorder, and especially someone who's like highly sensitive, like they become like such a like wholehearted or like completely healed person going through this process, because most people don't let you go so deep into your emotions, whereas eating disorder treatment knows that like there's so much mental complexity there.
I think so. I mean, I always tell clients, I said this yesterday, like in a group, you know, if you're expecting that you'll recover and you'll magically no longer feel anxious and your depression will be gone and you'll handle life and it'll be amazing, like you're wrong, you know, but you will have more coping skills and you will know that when something happens, it's not all or nothing and you can cry as opposed to you can go like purge. Mm-hmm. Carolyn Costin, who started Montanito and was one of the first pioneers in terms of like being a recovered person as a clinician, she always used to say, eating disorder clients are like the canaries in the coal mine, in the sense that back in the day, if they were testing whether a coal mine was safe, they would send in a canary, which are like highly, highly sensitive birds. And if they would come out of the coal mine, it was a safe place. And if they didn't, meant that there could be like even a slight thing that someone else wouldn't pick up on that was not safe for humans to go down there. And she always said people with eating disorders are the canaries. We're hypersensitive, take in things.
Absorb everyone's energy.
Exactly. Right. And I think that, you know, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's all assets and liabilities in the sense that that also means that we can be really passionate. We can be really empathic. And I think that empathic, empathetic, I always confuse which one is which.
Either one.
But I think that that doesn't have to be a bad thing. And I'm still an incredibly sensitive person. That's the thing about recovery. Sure, I'm fully recovered. I'm still sensitive. And I can also say when I'm having a reaction to something, let's say I see someone, great example, I think everyone can relate to this. You're walking on the street, you see two people laughing and looking at you, and some people maybe might hear this and be like, okay. Right. A lot of people who are sensitive are like, is it me? Is there something on?
Yeah, I could like feel like that happened to me 20 times today. Like right. That's just the way.
That's like a common thing.
Right.
And I think that at this point, with all the work that I've done and the work that I like continue to do in the sense that you're always growing. I'm recovered. I don't use food in any way, but I'm always a growing human being. Now, instead of sort of being like, oh my God, I can stop even and be like, okay, it could be there's something they're laughing at, or like, are you doing that thing you do where like you assume, and then I can just like move on, as opposed to maybe like stopping in somewhere and being like, what's wrong with me? Everyone hates me, which is what I used to feel like, like this is just because it's me. And now I'm like, okay, it could be they're laughing at me. Like that could be true. It's not saying like, it's not about you, Temimah. Like, no, maybe they are. Maybe I look ridiculous. Maybe they hate my shoes.
Right.
But also like, does that matter? And like, could it be something else? Okay, it could. I'm going to move on now.
Right. So interesting, because I was going to ask you, this is a perfect example. I was going to ask you like what I see in my practice. And like, I guess this is new since I'm like newly working in my practice, that binging, but also restricting is a coping mechanism.
Yes.
Just like somebody who's struggling with emotional pain, they might cut themselves so that they don't have to feel that emotional pain. The same with restricting. You could sort of get some sort of high from being hungry or numbing.
Yeah, I think that people often describe restricting as a bit more passive and binging and purging as more active, in the sense that sometimes people will intentionally think I'm going to eat that meal and then restrict as a way of sort of like as a reaction or coping. I think more people will say it feels like a baseline of like restriction feels very passive in this, even though it is active, in the sense that it feels like that's just like kind of what I do. Whereas binging or purging feels like I'm taking an action. I'm going to like get the food. I'm going to do X. And some people might disagree, but that's what I've heard for the most part. So I think some people feel like more shame with the binging and purging for various reasons. And one of them being, it feels like an active thing. Like I could stop that. Whereas people will say like, oh, the restriction is just like, that's what I do.
Right.
Which is interesting to note as well.
It's like a non-act. I'm not eating.
Yeah, for some people, absolutely.
Right. So I wanted to just address the other part of like your journey to recovery was that you said that you watched a video about like Jewish people, like Orthodox Jews who were suffering from eating disorders. And for you, that was very, I guess, healing, or like opened you up to recovery, because maybe you felt like there was this stigma against mental health or eating disorders in the Jewish world. Is that how you felt?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I think that at the time, the only people I had known who had eating disorders, like either I felt like they got over it really quickly, which isn't necessarily true, but if you think about, just to tie in for a second, like the media's portrayal of eating disorders, like if anyone knows, there was a character on Glee who had an eating disorder, and like 3 episodes later, she was okay. So it comes off to a lot of people. It's also very secretive of like, oh, it happened, now you're done, when it can be like the average of 7 years of, recovery.
Wow.
But anyway, yeah, I think I felt like the only people I had known were like someone who like came and spoke in our school, and like a neighbor of mine. And that was really it. And I always say like, I was super judgmental before I knew and had an eating disorder. I heard about like Mary-Kate Olsen when I was a kid, and I was like, she should just eat. This is ridiculous.
Right.
You were judging yourself. I get it.
Right. You feel like you were judging yourself?
I think I was judging myself because I was like, you should just get over this. Like you're, I don't know, you stop it. Like, this is silly. But I think more so like that I think people assume that if you had an eating, or you have an eating disorder, like you understand it, when really like I didn't understand it until I went through it. So when I meet families, especially who are sort of like, why does he do this? Like, why can't he stop? I want to pause, and instead of getting angry, validating and saying like, yeah, it's really confusing. It's really hard to understand.
Right.
But yeah, I think I didn't get it at all. And I also think that I definitely was familiar with depression and like my friend group and things like that. But I also feel like I didn't necessarily have people around me that I knew were like struggling with something, even though people could have been, but it wasn't talked about, or it wasn't really happening at that point. And so I felt like I was really like isolated, and I felt shame. And I felt like, on the one hand, part of me was like, you don't even have a problem. On the other hand, it was like, you should just stop doing this, but you can't because you have a problem. And it was like these conflicting parts of me, of which we call, this is Caroline Costin's kind of term, like the eating disorder self and the healthy self. So a part of me was like, you need help. This is an issue. You're like not forming sentences. And the other part of me was like, this is like nothing. But yeah, I think that video, that just like opened my eyes to the fact that I wasn't alone, which that's one of the reasons why even now I continue to be open about my history, even though like my role, I think, in the eating disorder field is definitely clinician based, because it's a real thing that happens. I also think like I'm not, and I don't say this in a self-pity way, like I'm not that special. Like I'm like an average gal that like this happened to, and it's not because I had this terrible upbringing, which that is can be a factor for some people, but I just was a person who didn't really know how to cope, and food became the way that I coped.
Right. So what would be like like what I'm hearing you saying is like kind of like breaking the stigma against like either mental health or an eating disorder, having the support, and also like you said, grieving the eating disorder. So for me that, and validating. So like a lot of this is like all that emotional work, like you were saying, like the example you were saying, you see somebody, two people on the street laughing, you think it might be you, you're able to have that CBT conversation in your head, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Noticing the thought, what's your automatic thought, and then changing it with something more positive. Absolutely. So what would you say is like, let's say somebody's listening to this who's struggling with disordered eating disorder, or has a family member, what would be like your 3 top tips?
Let's think. Okay. So I think it's tough because my tips are always really general because everyone's so different and all eating disorders are so different. I think one is, again, it's sort of vague, but I've seen this always work. Be curious and be non-judgmental. Because I think that lack of those things leads to an increased shame spiral, increased secrecy, and non-judgmental also includes like not blaming yourself, not blaming the person, let's say in the client role, if you're a family member or a partner or a friend or something, and being curious and not saying, I think even not saying like, I listened to this thing and I know now that you do this, and saying like, I listened to this thing and it made me wonder, like, do you feel like you're grieving? Or, like like, does grief ever feel like it plays a role? Because someone else might say like, that's not me at all. Right. So being curious will not like steer you wrong. And being non-judgmental. I think, the idea, just from what we talked about, that's important is like, you don't have to want to fully recover to make change. So you don't have to be committed to saying like, you know what, you're telling me that like everything we know about diets in terms of, 95% of people who go on a diet, all that stuff, like, you're telling me this, but I'm not sure I'm ready to give up yet. That doesn't mean that you don't have to seek help or be you yourself curious. Right. See where it takes you. You don't have to be committed to the end goal. If anything, it's more about like, what are you ready for right now? Because I think that stops people from getting help. They're sort of like, I know what you're going to tell me to do. You're going to tell me to recover, and I don't want to. And it's like, you can still get help.
Does that play into the whole like perfectionism? Like many people within, they say
maybe, yeah. I mean, it could be for some people. I also think some people are like, I'm not yet drinking the Kool-Aid. So like, if I don't want to fully recover yet, what's the point? Like, so in a way it could be perfectionism. I think a little bit more so like the black or white. It could also just be like, I'll wait till I'm ready. Right. And I've asked clients, it's like a fun little game I play, like, okay, so when do you think you'll be recovered? Right. Or when do you think you'll want to recover? And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, in like 2 years? You're like, oh, totally. Right. And we get to a point until we can say like, what's the divide? And usually it's like somewhere in 6 months. Cause I'm like, a year? And they're like, yeah, absolutely. I'm like, 3 months. They're like, no. Right. And then we look at like, okay, so what are you willing to do today? And we also don't have to have a benchmark. We don't know when you're going to recover. Right. It's like a fun little thing I like to do.
That's really great. And also like this training I was saying with Jessica Setnick, like she always like refutes that idea, like somebody can never recover. Cause she said, if they're better from yesterday till today, like they feel 1% better, then you did a good job and they're doing a good job. Like it's not about 100% recovery. It's about moving one step forward. And even if it's 5 steps back, like you're still, making that progress. You're trying.
Yeah. I think the kind of like the last thing, and there could be so many more, is like a full team is crucial. So anyone who says like, I don't need this person because I have that, like everyone's trained with expertise in different areas. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a dietitian. I can't pretend to be. You could tell me your meal plan and I could think like, cool, that sounds good. And I don't know. Right. So a full team is so essential. And so like, I just think people dismiss that and they're like, I'll be fine with my psychiatrist. And it's like, you need everybody. Right. Might not be the case for disordered eating as much, but I would say like being open to who is recommended to you if you're willing to say like, this isn't really working for me, or I want to explore a difference. Because I think, and giving consent, people should be talking to each other. Your therapist and dietitian should be collaborating. You can do, like a session with both people at some point if you want.
For sure.
That's actually one of the best things that people can do.
And even just for that additional support, like 2 people care about me,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's sort of like where I would start. I think everyone's so different, so it's really hard to know. But those are the three I would start with.
Okay, awesome. Super informative. And do you want to say like where people can find you or reach you?
Yeah. So I have a website. It's www.temimah.com. My name is spelled T-E-M as in Mary, I-M as in Mary, A-H. So that has a bit of information on my private practice and what I do. And like if people are interested in hearing me speak and things like that. Yeah, I appreciate, Gila, you arranging this. This has been really great.
It's so awesome. I learned so much.
Maybe we can do it again. We'll do like a part 2.
Totally. And people can send in their questions if they want.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.